Okay, now what if I wanted to continue painting here inside Photoshop, but rather than painting with one color, I wanted to actually paint with two colors at a time. I'll show you what I mean here. Right now, down at the bottom of my toolbox, I can see that my foreground color is the gray that I selected earlier, and my background color is white here. I'm going to click on this little guy right here, the little curved double-headed arrow. I'll click on him, and that flips my foreground and background colors. And then over in the toolbox, I'll go and grab another gray. I'll click on a gray swatch there, and I'm just going to make my brush a little bit smaller here because I'm going to get right inside his arm here. And of course, now when I click and drag, I'm painting with the darker gray. Now, at any time, I can switch back to the lighter gray just by clicking on that same button down in the bottom area of the toolbox. Switch back to the lighter gray, start painting in his upper arm here, for example. I could click on that same button again, continue painting inside my artwork here, back and forth, back and forth. Now, to speed things up even more, what I could do is simply use the X key on my keyboard. So if I hit X, take a look at the bottom area of my toolbox. I just flipped my foreground and background color. So now I'm back on the light gray here. So I could fill in an area here with the light gray if I wanted to. Hit the X key again, I'm back on the dark gray, and I could continue painting those areas. So just hitting the X key on my keyboard is all it takes. Now I wanted to show something else as well, in addition to working with multiple colors. Up on the options bar, I also have a few settings here. I have opacity and flow and my airbrush settings. So what I could do is, rather than painting with 100% opacity, I could drop that down a little bit and now paint with a shade of my color. And every time I start and stop, it's throwing down more paint as I go here. So I don't have to paint with 100% opacity all the time. In fact, reducing your opacity is a great way to create special effects like shading and things like this, right? So that's your opacity. I'll crank that back up. The flow gives you like an airbrush effect as well. And that's sort of used in tandem with this airbrush setting. So if you want to create sort of airbrush effects here inside your artwork, you can certainly use that as well. So rather than having the flow at 100% throwing down paint all the time, again, I can adjust the amount of paint that's getting thrown down onto the canvas. Okay, I'm going to bring that back up to 100% here, and I'll turn off my airbrush modifier there. Now, of course, I could continue painting here inside Photoshop, painting in my artwork here. However, I want to show you something else as well as you're working along. I decide that I want to start painting in the buttons here on his chest, and I've decided to make these red. So I'm going to go over to the toolbox, and I will click on a red color swatch, and I'll just zoom in a little bit here. Command plus on the Mac side, Control plus on the Windows side. I'll reduce my brush size down, and I'll paint in these areas here. Something like this. I could use the opacity setting and the flow setting up on my options bar if I wanted to create some shading here as well. And of course, what I could do is I could hit the X key on my keyboard because I noticed that I've left a little bit of white here. So I'm just filling in with the lighter gray here, right around there. Something like this, right? And then I'm going to zoom out a little bit. What if I wanted to go back to that dark gray? I've lost the dark gray inside the bottom area of my toolbox. I'm going to hit the X key to go back to the red here as if I were going to paint in the other button here. And then if I wanted to go back to the gray, this dark gray here, well, I could guess at what swatch I had selected out of the swatches panel. But what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to lift the color out of the drawing instead. I could go over to the toolbox and click on the eyedropper tool. That's one way to sample color. But instead, with the brush tool still selected, I'm going to hold down Alt here on the Windows side or Option on the Mac. And that toggles me to the eyedropper tool whenever I have the brush tool selected. So I'll just single click on that dark gray. And now I'm back to the dark gray. I can continue filling in the areas that I want to paint in this darker gray color. And then if I wanted to go back to the red, again, just hold down Alt on the Windows side, Option on the Mac, and then continue painting with that color. So it's very easy to flip between your colors here inside Photoshop as you're painting in your artwork. Okay, that's looking pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. All right, now the next thing that I want to do is I want to mix my own custom color for this guy's eye here. I could go and choose a color once again out of the swatches panel, but instead I decide that I want to create my own custom color. So I'm going to open up the color palette here in Photoshop. If you don't see them on screen, head to your window menu and look for color. And inside the color palette, let me show you what we have here. We have these color sliders. I have cyan, magenta, yellow, and black color sliders here. You may see red, green, and blue RGB sliders. That's okay. I'll talk about that in just a second. And then down at the bottom of the color palette, I have this color ramp where I can go and sample a color here if I want. And as you can see, I can actually click and drag across this color ramp to go and find the color that I want. So I can either mix using the sliders that I see at the top, use the ramp across the bottom to find a color, or if I knew, for example, my cyan, magenta, yellow, and black color values, I could just drop them into these fields here that I see. Now, at any time, I can go up to the top of the color palette, open up the color palette menu, and switch the color sliders that I'm using. Here I'm on CMYK. You may have been on RGB, so I can just go RGB. That switches my color sliders, so now I'm mixing color using red, green, and blue instead. I'm going to go back to CMYK here, and what I'm after, I want to mix for myself sort of a bright yellow here. See what I can come up with here. I know that I won't have much cyan, much magenta, but I will have a lot of yellow and probably not so much black unless I want to make it a little bit darker. Maybe something like this. Now notice that as I'm mixing my color here inside the color palette, check out the color area down at the bottom of the toolbox. The foreground color has now been set to the color that I mixed inside the color palette. What does that mean? Well, with the brush tool, I can start painting directly on my artwork with the color that I just mixed inside the color palette. I'll crank up my brush size here to speed things up a little bit. So you can definitely use the swatches panel if you'd like to work with a pre-created color, a pre-mixed color, or definitely use your color palette if you'd like to go and make your own custom colors. Now, I got to show you something else here in terms of creating your own custom colors in Photoshop. Something else that I could do is go and click on that foreground color swatch inside Photoshop. And I'm greeted with Photoshop's color picker. You may have seen this before. I don't know. Let me give you a quick tour of this guy. Where you'd probably want to start inside this dialog box is this vertical color ramp that goes right up the center of the dialog box. This guy allows me to go and set the color that I want to start with, and then this main window here allows me to set the specific hue for that color. And I'm just single clicking here to go and find the exact hue. So I could go down into the darks if I wanted to, or way up into the lights, all depending on what I want to do. So let's say I'll wind up around here. Alternatively, I could use H, S, and B color values, red, green, and blue RGB color values. I could use CMYK values or lab values if I want, or I could use this little fella right here. This guy is what's known as a hexadecimal color value. He's used in web design. Let's say, for example, I've gone and set a color inside Dreamweaver or maybe Flash, for example. Well, those programs use hexadecimal color values. I could select that hexadecimal color value and bring it over into Photoshop and just paste it right into this field and get the exact same color inside Photoshop. So whichever way you want to work, go ahead and choose a color there. I'm going to click on OK. So I've got a nice blue here. That gets loaded into the foreground color swatch. Now I want to save this blue. I want to save him into my swatches for future use. So I'm going to go over to the swatches panel here. I'll pop him open over on the right, and all I have to do is single click anywhere down at the bottom area of the swatches panel. Just single click there. Of course, my cursor changes to a little paint bucket, and I get the color swatch name dialog box coming up. You can call this guy whatever you like. I'll call this Jeff's Blue. And click on OK. There he is. He gets added down at the bottom there. Of course, with my brush tool still selected, I could start painting with him. I don't want to, though, because I like my yellow eye. Instead, what I want to do is I want to go and create a custom color for this robot's eye patch. What robot wears an eye patch? I don't know. The ones that I draw, anyway. So I'm going to go and find, I want to create sort of a brown, sort of leathery color here. So I'll just drag that color ramp down a little bit, go and find the hue that I want, maybe something like that. I'll click on OK. And then down at the bottom of the swatches, I'll single click again. And I'll call this guy Eye Patch and click on OK. All right, now let's paint this guy real quick here. Again, I'm using my open square bracket and close square bracket keys on my keyboard to increase and decrease my brush size here. There we go, just make my way around. It's a lot of fun painting inside Photoshop, especially when you have a good cartoon to paint. If you have one of those Wacom tablets, this is even more fun painting inside Photoshop. Okay, good stuff. Almost done. There's our eye patch, and there's creating some custom colors for our painting. Now, let me show you a couple of neat things you can do with your swatches here that you're creating over inside the Swatches panel. I'm going to go to the Swatches panel menu up in the top right corner, and I'm looking for Save Swatches. I want to save this color panel out for future use. So down in the bottom area of this dialog box, I'll give my swatches a name. I'll call this Robot Colors. Click on Save. There it is there. So now I've saved out my swatches. Now let me show you a couple of other things here. What if I wanted to go and access some pre-mixed printing inks, some Pantone inks, or spot colors as they're often called? I'm going to go back up to my swatches panel menu up at the top here. And there I can see all of my Pantone color libraries. So for example, I'm going to open up Pantone Solid Coated. And I'm going to get this dialog box here. Essentially what this dialog box is asking me is, do I want to add the Pantone library onto the bottom of the current swatches palette? Or do I want to completely load in the Pantone library and lose all of these swatches? Well, I'm going to click on OK, and that will load in just the Pantone library. Now, working with Pantone inks is a lot of fun, but it's a little bit difficult to work inside this view. As you can see, when I hover my mouse over top of my color swatches, I do get a little message there, Pantone 1525, for example. But what I'll do is I'll go back up to my palette menu, and I'm going to choose Small List. And that gives me a much better look at my Pantone colors here. And of course, if I wanted to use any of these, I would just choose them out of the list here. The color gets added to the foreground color swatch inside the toolbox. I'm still on my brush tool, and of course I could start painting with that color if I wanted to. So you can mess around with that a little bit if you like. I'm going to go and load in that swatches palette, the one that I just saved out a moment ago. So I'm going to head back up to the swatches palette menu, right up at the top here. Now, I could choose load swatches, but what that's going to do is that's going to append or add on my swatches to the current set of swatches, to that set of Pantone swatches. So rather than choosing load swatches, I'm going to choose replace swatches. Right there. There's my Robot Colors, the color swatches I just saved out. I'll click on Load down at the bottom. And my swatches get loaded in. Now, I'm still in that small list view, so I'm going to go back up to the swatches palette menu, and I'll choose Small Thumbnail. There I'm back, and there's the few swatches that I had created myself, as well as the original swatches. Okay, great. Good stuff. So there's a look at creating your own custom colors inside Photoshop. You saw working with the swatches panel, saving out your swatches, loading in other swatch palettes. You also saw creating your own custom colors inside the color palette and inside Photoshop's color picker.